The howling wind carried the icy snow in merciless waves across the Montana plains, as Elizabeth Summers struggled against nature's fury, her frozen fingers clutching the splintered remains of her wagon's lead harness. Winter of 1887 had come early and with unforgiving vengeance to Helena, Montana, a brutal reminder that the West took as easily as it gave. Elizabeth had known the journey from town would be dangerous with the threatening storm clouds, but her father's medicine couldn't wait. The town doctor had been clear. Without the tonic, Thomas Summers wouldn't survive the night. At 22, Elizabeth wasn't ready to lose her only remaining family. Her mother had succumbed to fever 3 winters past, leaving Elizabeth and her father to manage their small homestead alone. The wagon wheel had cracked 5 miles from home when she hit a rock hidden beneath the freshly fallen snow. Her horse, spooked by the sudden jolt, had broken free and bolted toward home, leaving Elizabeth alone with a broken wagon and dwindling hope as the temperature dropped and daylight faded. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, her words immediately stolen by the wind. Each step became heavier than the last, her boots sinking deep into the mounting snow. The small satchel containing her father's medicine felt impossibly heavy against her hip. Elizabeth didn't notice when she first stumbled. Her legs, numb from cold and exhaustion, simply gave way beneath her. She fell forward into the snow, the white powder cushioning her fall but immediately beginning to cover her prostrate form. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled violently before giving out. "I'm sorry, Pa," she murmured, her eyelids growing impossibly heavy as the cold began to feel almost warm, a dangerous comfort she dimly recognized as surrender to the elements. The darkness at the edges of her vision nearly consumed her when a shadow cut through the white haze. Large hands gripped her shoulders, turning her over. Through frost-crusted lashes, Elizabeth made out the silhouette of a man, his face obscured by a thick scarf and wide-brimmed hat. "Can you hear me, miss?" His voice was deep, concern evident despite the howling wind. Elizabeth tried to respond, but her lips were too numb to form words. She managed only a weak nod. "I'm taking you home," the stranger declared, sweeping her into his arms with surprising gentleness. The man stood tall against the driving snow, cradling Elizabeth against his chest. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath layers of leather and wool, a reassuring counterpoint to the chaos of the storm. "Name's Owen Zachary," he said, beginning to trudge through the deepening snow. "Got a place about 5 miles east. We'll get you warmed up." 5 miles. The distance seemed insurmountable in this weather, yet Owen walked with determined strides, occasionally adjusting his hold on her to keep her close to his body heat. "My father," Elizabeth managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Medicine." Owen glanced down, noting the satchel still clutched in her frozen fingers. "Where's your home?" 5 miles. West, Summers' homestead. Owen's pace faltered momentarily. "That's Thomas Summers' place." Elizabeth nodded weakly, surprised he knew her father. 10 miles round trip in this blizzard. He seemed to be calculating odds in his head. "We'll get you warmed first, then I'll see about getting to your pa." Elizabeth wanted to protest, to insist they go directly to her father, but consciousness was slipping away despite her best efforts. The last thing she remembered was being pressed tightly against Owen's chest as he battled through the worsening storm, his heart beating steadily beneath her frozen cheek. When Elizabeth next opened her eyes, she was enveloped in warmth. A fire crackled nearby, its golden light dancing across unfamiliar log walls. She was lying on a bed covered with thick furs, and someone had changed her into dry clothes that were much too large for her frame. "You're awake." The deep voice came from a chair beside the fire. Elizabeth turned to see her rescuer clearly for the first time. Owen Zachary was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the color of worn leather. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least once, and a thin scar ran along his right cheekbone, but something about his steady gaze made Elizabeth's breath catch. "My father," she said, her voice hoarse. "The medicine already delivered," Owen said, standing and moving to pour a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "I rode out as soon as I got you settled." Elizabeth struggled to sit up, wincing as feeling returned to her extremities in painful waves. "You went through that storm again." For a stranger, Owen handed her the steaming cup, careful not to touch her still tender fingers. "Your pa's no stranger. He saved my life 2 years back when my appendix burst. Doc was away, but Thomas knew enough to operate. Never got a chance to repay him." He settled back into his chair. "Until tonight." Elizabeth sipped the strong coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what this man had done. "Your pa's doing better," Owen continued. "That medicine worked quick. Your neighbor, Martha Wilson, is staying with him until the storm passes." Relief washed over Elizabeth, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "I didn't think I'd make it," she admitted. "The wheel broke, and then Samson, my horse, he bolted." "Found him huddled in your barn," Owen said with a slight smile. "Smarter than most people, heading home in a storm like that." "How did you find me?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly realizing how miraculous her rescue had been. Owen's expression grew more serious. "I was tracking a wolf that's been taking calves. Saw your wagon first, then followed the tracks. Almost missed you. Snow was covering you fast." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Another 10 minutes and I might have." The thought sent a chill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with her recent exposure. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice light, "it seems I owe you my life, Mr. Zachary." "Owen," he corrected, "and you don't owe me anything, Miss Summers." "Elizabeth," she responded automatically, "and I disagree." A small smile touched the corner of Owen's mouth, transforming his rugged features. "Rest now, Elizabeth. Storm's not letting up until morning." Elizabeth wanted to protest that she'd rested enough, but her body disagreed. Her eyelids grew heavy once more, and she felt herself sinking back into the comfortable furs. "You'll be here when I wake?" she asked, her voice already thick with approaching sleep. "I'll be here," Owen promised, and something in his tone made Elizabeth believe him completely. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, trapping Elizabeth at Owen's modest cabin. During that time, she learned he had come to Montana 5 years earlier after the cattle operation he'd worked for in Texas had closed. He'd saved enough to buy a small parcel of land and a few dozen head of cattle, which he managed entirely on his own. Owen, for his part, discovered Elizabeth had been running the Summers homestead virtually alone since her mother's passing, as her father's health had been steadily declining. She could shoot as well as most men, knew how to repair fences, and could recite poetry from memory, a hobby that had started with her mother's lessons and continued as her private passion. On the 3rd evening, as they sat before the fire sharing a simple stew Owen had prepared, Elizabeth felt a curious reluctance about the storm's imminent passing. "I should be home helping my father," she said, watching the flames dance. "Yet I can't deny these days have been restful." Owen added another log to the fire. "Sometimes life forces us to stop moving for a reason." "What reason would that be?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely curious. Owen considered her question longer than she expected. "To see what's right in front of us that we've been too busy to notice." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm, and not from the fire's heat. "Tell me about your family," she said, changing the subject. "Are they still in Texas?" A shadow crossed Owen's face. "Lost my parents to fever when I was 16. Had a younger brother, Daniel, who went to California during the gold rush. Haven't heard from him in 3 years." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "Loneliness is its own kind of hardship out here." "It is," Owen agreed, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. "Though less so these past few days." Elizabeth looked down at her empty bowl, unsure how to respond to the gentle admission. The next morning, the storm broke at last. The sun emerged, brilliant and blinding against the pristine snow that blanketed everything in sight. Owen saddled his horse after breakfast, preparing to take Elizabeth home. "Your father must be worried," he said, tightening the cinch on his saddle. Elizabeth nodded, though her heart wasn't entirely in agreement with the return journey. "I'm sure Martha has told him where I am." Owen helped her mount in front of him, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Elizabeth settled against him as they began the 5-mile trek to her homestead, acutely aware of his chest at her back and his arms around her as he held the reins. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves and the occasional distant call of a bird. "Will you come in when we arrive?" Elizabeth asked eventually. "My father would want to thank you properly." "I'd like that," Owen replied, his breath warm against her hair. When they crested the final hill and the Summers homestead came into view, Elizabeth felt a rush of conflicting emotions: relief at seeing home, worry for her father, and an inexplicable sadness that her time with Owen was coming to an end. Thomas Summers was sitting in a rocking chair by the window when they arrived, wrapped in blankets despite the fire blazing in the hearth. His face, gaunt from illness, brightened considerably when Elizabeth entered. "There's my girl," he said, his voice stronger than Elizabeth had expected. "Martha told me a brave cowboy rescued you from the storm." Elizabeth moved to embrace her father carefully. "He did more than that, Pa. He brought your medicine through the blizzard after finding me." Owen stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, until Thomas beckoned him closer. "Owen Zachary," Thomas said, recognition clear in his eyes. "Never thought the boy I cut open on my kitchen table would be saving my daughter years later." Owen's usual composure faltered slightly. "Just repaying a debt, sir." Thomas shook his head. "Life debts can't be measured that way, son." "You're welcome at our table anytime." That evening, Owen stayed for supper, helping Elizabeth prepare the meal while Thomas rested. Their movements around the small kitchen felt surprisingly natural, as if they'd been cooking together for years rather than days. "You're good with him," Owen observed quietly as Elizabeth checked on her sleeping father. "Patient." Elizabeth tucked the blanket more securely around Thomas's shoulders. "He's all I have left. The illness takes more of him each winter, but he fights." "Like his daughter," Owen said with a small smile. As Owen prepared to leave after the meal, Elizabeth walked him to the barn where his horse waited. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, standing in the lantern light as he saddled his horse. Owen turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. "Seeing you home safe is thanks enough." A sudden boldness took hold of Elizabeth. "Will you come back, not for thanks, but to visit?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither had voiced during their days together. Owen stepped closer, close enough that Elizabeth could see the varying shades of brown in his eyes. "Would you want me to?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Owen's hand rose slowly to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle against her cheek. "Then I'll come." And he did. The following Sunday, Owen arrived with a repaired wheel for Elizabeth's wagon and a small bundle of books he'd borrowed from a friend in town. The Sunday after that, He brought venison and helped Elizabeth repair a section of fencing that had collapsed under the snow's weight. Each visit revealed new facets of the quiet cowboy. Elizabeth learned he could read Latin, having been taught by a scholar who had worked alongside him on a ranch in his youth. She discovered his careful, meticulous nature extended to everything from mending tack to carving delicate wooden figures that he somewhat self-consciously presented to her on his fourth visit. For Thomas, Owen's weekly appearances became something to anticipate. Though the older man remained weak, he seemed to rally when the cowboy was present, eager to share stories and advice about ranching in the Montana Territory. As winter deepened, so did the connection between Elizabeth and Owen. Their conversations, initially cautious and polite, grew increasingly intimate. Elizabeth found herself sharing hopes she'd never voiced aloud, dreams of seeing the ocean someday, of perhaps writing stories of her own. Owen spoke of his desire to expand his small herd, to build a ranch that could sustain a family. A family, Elizabeth had repeated softly one evening as they sat on the porch despite the cold, watching stars emerge in the clear sky. Owen had turned to her then, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen. Yes, someday. The word hung between them, full of promise. February brought new challenges as Thomas's health deteriorated rapidly. The medicine that had worked in December seemed less effective now, and Elizabeth found herself increasingly anxious as she watched her father grow weaker. Owen began visiting more frequently, often riding through difficult conditions to bring supplies or simply to offer his strength when tasks became too much for Elizabeth alone. He never mentioned the additional 5-mile journey each way, but Elizabeth noticed the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed his eyes after particularly harsh weather. One brutally cold night after Thomas had finally fallen into restless sleep, Elizabeth found Owen still sitting by the fire, though she'd assumed he'd departed hours earlier. "You should be home," she chided gently. "It's dangerous in this cold." Owen looked up from the flames. "I wanted to make sure you both were settled first." Elizabeth sat beside him, the day's worries finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. "He's not getting better," she whispered, tears threatening. "I'm losing him." Without hesitation, Owen's arm went around her shoulders, drawing her against him. "You're not alone in this, Elizabeth." The simple statement broke something open inside her. She turned her face into his shoulder and wept for her father, for herself, for the uncertain future stretching before her. Owen held her silently, one hand stroking her hair in gentle, rhythmic movements that gradually calmed her. When she finally lifted her face, Owen wiped the remaining tears from her cheeks with calloused thumbs, his touch infinitely tender. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, suddenly acutely aware of their proximity. Owen's eyes dropped briefly to her lips before returning to meet her gaze. "Elizabeth," he said, her name sounding like a question. She answered by closing the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a tentative kiss. Owen responded with gentle restraint, his hand cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile. When they parted, Elizabeth kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the feeling. When she opened them, she found Owen watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I should go," he said reluctantly, though he made no move to release her. "Stay," Elizabeth replied simply. And he did, sleeping on a pallet before the fire while Elizabeth kept vigil by her father's bedside. It was the first of many such nights as winter slowly began to yield to spring, and Thomas's condition continued its gradual decline. By April, the snow had retreated, revealing muddy roads and the first tentative shoots of green grass. Thomas, now confined to bed, spent much of his time sleeping, though he remained lucid during his waking hours. It was during one such period of clarity that he called both Elizabeth and Owen to his bedside. "Not much time left," Thomas stated matter-of-factly, his once robust voice now barely above a whisper. Elizabeth started to protest, but her father raised a trembling hand to silence her. "Need to say this while I still can," he insisted. He turned his gaze to Owen. "Been watching you with my daughter these months." Owen straightened, meeting the older man's evaluating look without flinching. "You love her," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Owen's hand found Elizabeth's, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Yes, sir, I do." The simple declaration made Elizabeth's heart stutter. Though their feelings had grown obvious through actions and unspoken understanding, neither had voiced the word until now. Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good, she needs someone steady." He shifted his attention to Elizabeth. "And you, girl, you feel the same." Elizabeth tightened her grip on Owen's hand. "I do, Pa." A smile crossed Thomas's gaunt face. "Then I can go easier knowing that." He beckoned Owen closer. "The homestead papers are in the Bible. It'll all be Elizabeth's. Help her keep it if that's what she wants." "I will," Owen promised solemnly. Thomas nodded, his strength visibly fading. "Now let an old man rest," he murmured, eyes already closing. Outside the bedroom, Elizabeth turned to Owen, emotions too complex for words threatening to overwhelm her. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "What you said to my father?" Owen took both her hands in his. "I've never meant anything more," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I love you, Elizabeth Summers. Have since I carried you through that blizzard." Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd been shedding for weeks. "I love you too," she whispered, the words bringing with them a sense of rightness that cut through her grief. Owen pulled her gently into his arms, his heart beat strong against her cheek, the same steady rhythm that had comforted her as he'd carried her through the snow months earlier. Thomas Summers passed peacefully. 2 days later, Elizabeth and Owen at his bedside. The funeral was small but well attended. Despite his reclusive nature in recent years, Thomas had been respected in Helena and the surrounding homesteads. The days that followed were a blur for Elizabeth as she navigated grief while attempting to maintain the homestead alone. Owen came daily, often staying until well after dark, helping with chores and simply providing silent support when words failed. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elizabeth was sorting through her father's belongings when Owen arrived, his expression unusually serious. "I need to ask you something," he said without preamble. Elizabeth set aside the shirt she'd been folding. "What is it?" Owen seemed to struggle with his words, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been thinking about what your father said, about helping you keep the homestead." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Yes, I want to do that," Owen continued, "but not just as a neighbor or a friend." He took a deep breath. "Elizabeth, I want to build a life with you, here on my land, wherever you want to be." Understanding dawned. "Owen Zachary," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady, "are you proposing marriage to me?" A flush crept up his neck, but his gaze remained steady. "Not very gracefully, it seems, but yes." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It was my mother's." Elizabeth looked at the ring, then back at Owen's face, the face that had become as essential to her as breathing over these past months. "Are you certain?" "The homestead isn't much, and I know nothing about cattle ranching." Owen stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I'm certain about you. Everything else we can figure out together." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I promised your father I'd help you keep this place if that's what you wanted. But I'm asking what you want, Elizabeth." Elizabeth considered the homestead that had been her entire world for so long. It held memories both painful and precious, but suddenly she could see beyond its boundaries. "I want a life with you," she said finally, "whether here or on your land or somewhere entirely new." The smile that broke across Owen's face was radiant. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Elizabeth said, feeling joy bubble up despite the recent grief. "Yes, I'll marry you, Owen." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had always been meant for her hand, and then kissed her with a passion that promised a lifetime of such moments. They were married in late May, when the prairie was alive with wildflowers. The ceremony was small, held in Helena's tiny church with Martha Wilson and a few of Owen's ranching friends as witnesses. Elizabeth wore her mother's dress, carefully altered with Martha's help, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Owen had gathered that morning. Their first decision as a married couple was where to make their home. Owen's cabin was too small for a family, and the Summers homestead held too many reminders of Thomas's decline. After much discussion, they chose a solution that honored both their pasts while looking toward their future. "We'll build new," Owen suggested, standing on a rise overlooking his property where it adjoined Elizabeth's inherited land. "Right here, where both properties meet." The symbolism wasn't lost on Elizabeth. "A perfect compromise," she agreed, leaning against her husband's solid frame as they surveyed what would become their shared future. Construction began immediately, with Owen and several neighbors raising the frame of a modest but sturdy house with room to expand as their family grew. Elizabeth, meanwhile, divided her time between maintaining her father's homestead and learning the intricacies of cattle ranching from Owen. Summer passed in a blur of hard work and shared discoveries. Elizabeth proved a quick study with the cattle, her natural affinity with animals making up for her lack of experience. Owen, in turn, revealed an unexpected talent for growing things, expanding Elizabeth's small kitchen garden into a productive plot that promised to sustain them through the coming winter. Their evenings were spent planning and dreaming, sometimes reading aloud from Owen's small collection of books, other times simply enjoying the physical closeness they denied themselves during the months of Thomas's illness. By August, their new home was complete enough to move in, though Owen continued to add finishing touches whenever time allowed. Elizabeth took immense pleasure in combining their belongings, her mother's china with Owen's hand-carved wooden cups, her books with his tools, creating a space that reflected both their pasts and their shared present. "It feels like the start of something important," Elizabeth observed one evening as they sat on their new porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Owen's arm tightened around her shoulders. "It is the most important thing I'll ever do." As autumn approached, bringing with it the first hints of the cold that would soon blanket the land, Elizabeth began to suspect a new change was coming. Her suspicions were confirmed when Martha, visiting to help preserve the garden's bounty, noticed Elizabeth's slight pallor during their canning. "When are you due?" the older woman asked bluntly, her eyes knowing. Elizabeth nearly dropped the jar she was filling. "Is it that obvious?" Martha chuckled. "Only to someone who's birthed 5 of her own. Have you told that husband of yours yet?" "No," Elizabeth admitted. "I wanted to be certain first." "You're certain," Martha declared with authority. "I'd say February or March by the look of you." That night, after Martha had departed with her share of the preserved vegetables, Elizabeth sat beside Owen before the fireplace in their new home. "I have something to tell you," she began, suddenly nervous despite her certainty of his reaction. Owen set aside the bridle he'd been mending. "What is it?" "We're going to have a child," Elizabeth said simply. "In late winter, Martha thinks." For a moment, Owen seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with a joy Elizabeth had never seen before. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." He moved to kneel before her chair, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he whispered, and the tenderness in his voice brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. Owen looked up at her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he said simply. Elizabeth placed her hand over his. "For what?" "For everything. For collapsing in that blizzard so I could find you. For letting me carry you home. For becoming my home." Elizabeth leaned down to kiss him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered against his lips. As winter once again approached Montana, Elizabeth and Owen prepared their new home for the coming cold and the new life that would join them when the snow began to melt. The repaired wagon that had once broken in a blizzard now carried supplies from town, and the path between their house and Owen's original cabin was well worn from daily trips to care for the expanding herd. One evening in early December, as snow began to fall outside their snug home, Owen returned from checking the cattle to find Elizabeth standing by the window, one hand resting on her growing belly as she watched the white flakes swirl in the gathering darkness. "Reminds me of the night we met," he said, coming to stand behind her and wrap his arms around her expanding waist. Elizabeth leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "That night changed everything." "For the better," Owen murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For the better," Elizabeth agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "Though I hope this little one never has to experience a Montana blizzard quite so directly." Owen laughed, placing a protective hand over their child. "No chance of that. Between the two of us, this child will never know what it means to face a storm alone." Elizabeth stood on tiptoe to kiss him, marveling at how a single moment of desperation in a blinding snowstorm had led to this: a home, a husband, a future brighter than she'd ever dared dream. "I love you, Owen Zachary," she whispered. "And I love you, Elizabeth Zachary," he replied, the name still new enough to bring a special light to his eyes. "Through blizzards and sunshine, now and always." The winter of 1888 proved to be as harsh as the previous one. But this time, Elizabeth faced the cold with Owen at her side and their child growing safely beneath her heart. When the February blizzards raged outside, they would sometimes stand at the window together, watching the fury of the storm while securely sheltered in the home they'd built. "Remember that day?" Owen would ask, and Elizabeth would nod, leaning against him. "How could I forget? It was the day my life truly began." As the winter slowly gave way to spring's first tentative warmth, Elizabeth's time drew near. Martha Wilson moved temporarily into their spare room, her experience with childbirth a comfort to both expectant parents. "First babies often take their time," she assured a nervously pacing Owen when Elizabeth's labor began on a clear March morning. "Go tend your cattle. We'll call if things progress quickly." Owen reluctantly did as instructed, though he remained within shouting distance of the house all day, returning every hour to check on his wife's progress. By nightfall, Elizabeth's labor had intensified. Owen refused to leave her side, holding her hand through each contraction and wiping her brow with a cool cloth during the brief moments of respite between pains. "You're the strongest person I know," he murmured as she gripped his hand with surprising force. "You can do this." "Tell me again," Elizabeth gasped between contractions, "about finding me in the snow." Understanding her need for distraction, Owen began the familiar story. "I was tracking that wolf, following his prints in the fresh snow when I saw something dark against all that white." He continued the tale they both knew by heart. adding details he'd never shared before the fear that had gripped him when he realized it was a person half buried in the snow. The desperate prayer he'd offered when he turned her over and saw her blue lips. The overwhelming relief when she'd responded to his voice. "I knew then," he said softly as Elizabeth breathed through another contraction, "that something important had happened. I didn't understand yet that I'd found the other half of myself." Elizabeth's eyes, tight with pain, softened momentarily. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered. "Always," Owen promised, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead. Just before dawn, after hours of labor that tested Elizabeth's endurance to its limits, their son entered the world with a robust cry that instantly brought tears to Owen's eyes. "A boy," Martha announced, efficiently cleaning and swaddling the newborn before placing him in Elizabeth's eager arms. "A strong one, too." Elizabeth gazed down at their child, taking in the shock of dark hair so like Owen's and the tiny features that somehow combined both of them into someone entirely new. "He's perfect," she breathed, looking up to find Owen watching them both with naked adoration. "What shall we name him?" Owen asked, gently touching their son's tiny clenched fist. Elizabeth considered the small life in her arms. "Thomas," she said, honoring her father. "Thomas Daniel Zachary." Owen's breath caught at the inclusion of his brother's name. "Thomas Daniel," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Perfect for our son." As spring fully claimed the land, bringing new growth and warm sunshine, the Zachary family settled into their new reality. Owen proved to be a natural father, as tender with his son as he was capable with his growing herd. Elizabeth recovered quickly from the birth, soon moving about their home with Thomas strapped to her chest as she managed household tasks. Their first year as parents brought challenges: sleepless nights, moments of uncertainty, the constant vigilance required by frontier life, but these were balanced by joys neither had anticipated. Thomas's first smile, the weight of his small body trusting them completely in sleep, the unique bond forged through shared responsibility. One clear evening in December, exactly 1 year after Owen had found Elizabeth collapsed in the snow, they bundled their 9-month-old son against the cold and walked together to the spot where their separate lands joined, now the center of their shared property. "I brought something to mark the occasion," Owen said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. Elizabeth, Thomas settled contentedly on her hip, unwrapped the gift to reveal a finely carved wooden box. Opening it, she found a small silver locket. "Open it," Owen urged softly. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, one of Thomas as a newborn, the other of Owen and Elizabeth on their wedding day. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Owen took the locket and fastened it around her neck. "To remember how far we've come," he said. "From strangers in a blizzard to this." Elizabeth looked around at the life they'd built, their home visible in the distance, cattle grazing in the protected valley below, their son warm and secure in her arms, and felt a happiness so complete it almost hurt. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a broken wagon wheel," she said with a smile. Owen laughed, drawing her and Thomas into his embrace. "I thank that wheel every day." As they walked back toward their home, the setting sun painting the snow-covered landscape in gold and pink, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The desperate struggle through the blizzard had seemed like an ending, the collapse of hope, the surrender to forces beyond her control. Instead, it had been a beginning. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Elizabeth smiled up at him, adjusting Thomas's woolen cap as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I'm thinking some storms bring us exactly where we need to be." Owen's arm tightened around her shoulders. "And some storms bring us exactly who we need." Together, the three of them continued toward home, leaving a single set of footprints in the fresh snow behind them, a family forged in a blizzard, strengthened by love, and walking confidently into whatever weather the future might hold. The years that followed were kind to the Zacharys. Their cattle operation prospered under Owen's careful management, expanding gradually until it became one of the most successful in the Helena area. Elizabeth, while maintaining her role as mother and homemaker, discovered an unexpected talent for breeding and training horses, eventually developing a small but profitable sideline selling well-trained stock to neighboring ranches. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Rebecca Ann, named for both Owen and Elizabeth's mothers. 2 years later, another son, James, completed their family circle. Life on the Montana frontier remained challenging. Harsh winters, occasional drought, the constant vigilance required to protect their livelihood from both human and natural threats. But the foundation Owen and Elizabeth had built proved strong enough to weather whatever came their way. On cold winter nights, they would often gather their children around the fireplace in the expanded home they'd built over the years, and tell them the story of how their family began, of a desperate journey through a blinding blizzard, a broken wagon, and the cowboy who carried their mother 5 miles to safety. "Did you know right away that you would fall in love?" Rebecca would inevitably ask, her romantic heart captivated by the tale. Owen and Elizabeth would exchange knowing smiles over their children's heads. "Sometimes," Owen would answer, reaching for Elizabeth's hand. "You don't recognize the most important moment of your life until after it's happened." And Elizabeth, her fingers intertwining with his the same strong hands that had once carried her through the snow, would add softly, "But once you know, you never forget." As Helena grew from a frontier outpost to a thriving town, the Zachary Ranch became known not only for its fine cattle and horses, but also for the family that ran it, the quiet, capable rancher, his intelligent wife, and their 3 children who embodied the best of both parents. On the 20th anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Owen surprised Elizabeth with a trip to the Pacific coast, fulfilling her long-ago expressed wish to see the ocean. Standing together on the shore, watching waves crash against the rocky California coastline, Elizabeth felt the same sense of wonder she'd experienced when Owen had first carried her into his cabin 2 decades earlier. "Worth the wait?" Owen asked, his arm around her waist, the silver in his hair catching the sunlight. Elizabeth leaned against him, savoring the moment. "Some things improve with anticipation," she replied, "like finding the right person to share them with." Their children, now young adults with dreams of their own, had remained at home to manage the ranch in their absence. Thomas, at 19, showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps, with an intuitive understanding of the land and animals that promised to carry the Zachary legacy forward. 16-year-old Rebecca possessed her mother's compassionate nature and had already declared her intention to become a teacher. Young James, 14 and endlessly curious, spoke of studying medicine, inspired by stories of his grandfather's skill at healing despite limited formal training. Returning home from their journey, Owen and Elizabeth found their ranch flourishing under their children's care, proof that what they had built extended beyond buildings and livestock to the values and capabilities they'd instilled in the next generation. "We've done well," Owen observed as they stood together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the familiar Montana landscape in shades of gold and purple. Elizabeth smiled, thinking of the frightened young woman who had collapsed in a blizzard decades ago, convinced her story was ending rather than just beginning. "Better than I ever dreamed possible," she agreed, turning to face the man who had carried her not just through a snowstorm but through life itself. "And it all started because you found me in the snow." Owen's eyes, still as warm and steady as they had been on that fateful day, held hers. "Best tracking I ever did," he said with a smile. "Found a treasure I wasn't even looking for." As twilight deepened into night, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Owen and Elizabeth Zachary stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created from a single act of courage in a blinding storm. Two lives that had converged in a moment of desperate need and forged something enduring, something beautiful, something that would outlast even the Montana winters. And in the gentle way, Owen's hand sought Elizabeth's, in the familiar comfort of their bodies leaning toward each other after decades together, in the quiet contentment that radiated between them. There remained the echo of that long-ago promise through blizzards and sunshine, through hardship and joy, now and always. A love that had begun when she collapsed in the snow, and he carried her home,